The 6th Armored Division had been driving east through Germany for 72 days when forward elements encountered the complex that would later be known by its administrative designation, Konzentrationslager Buchenwald. By April 1945, the Allied advance had accelerated beyond anything the strategic planners had anticipated. The Rhine crossings had succeeded, the Wehrmacht was disintegrating as a coherent fighting force, and the race toward Berlin had become as much a political calculation as a military necessity. General George Patton's Third Army was slicing through Thuringia with the kind of mechanized momentum that had characterized American operations since the breakout from Normandy, overrunning German defensive positions before they could be properly established, capturing towns and cities whose populations had been told by Nazi propaganda that they would fight to the last man. But the propaganda had been lies, as most propaganda is. By April, the German civilian population understood that the war was lost, that the 1,000-year Reich would not last another 1,000 days, and that survival required accommodation with the inevitable. White flags appeared in windows. Wehrmacht soldiers surrendered in groups, sometimes in entire battalions, relieved to be taken prisoner by the Americans rather than driven east to face the Soviets. The landscape the Americans were liberating showed evidence of 6 years of total war: bombed cities, cratered roads, displaced populations moving in columns that had no clear destination, only the vague hope that somewhere there might be food and shelter and an end to the violence. Lieutenant Colonel Samuel Parker, commanding officer of the 6th Armored Division's 68th Tank Battalion, had seen this desolation repeated in every town and village through which his unit had passed. He was a career officer, West Point class of 1936, who had learned his trade in the North African campaign and refined it through France and Germany. He understood mechanized warfare, logistics, the coordination of armor and infantry and artillery in combined arms operations. He had seen men die, his own men, enemy soldiers, civilians caught in crossfire, and had developed the professional detachment necessary to continue functioning in an environment where death was the constant companion of every tactical decision. But nothing in his training, nothing in 2 years of combat operations, had prepared him for what his forward reconnaissance elements reported at 14:37 hours on the 11th of April, 1945. The initial contact came from a platoon of light tanks, M5 Stuarts reconnaissance vehicles that had been probing ahead of the main column along the road toward Weimar. The platoon leader, Lieutenant Robert Hayes, transmitted a fragmentary report describing a large compound visible approximately 2 kilometers north of the main road. The compound featured multiple buildings enclosed by barbed wire fencing, guard towers at regular intervals, and what appeared to be extensive barracks or industrial structures. Hayes reported no defensive fire, no visible German military presence, but something else: smoke rising from what might be chimneys or crematoriums, and a smell that carried on the wind. A smell that Hayes described as like nothing I've encountered before, sir. Sweet and rotten at the same time, like a slaughterhouse that's been left to rot. Parker ordered the reconnaissance platoon to hold position and wait for infantry support. Standard doctrine when approaching an unknown installation, tanks were vulnerable in built-up areas, effective against armor and fortifications, but limited when clearing structures that might contain infantry with Panzerfausts or other anti-tank weapons. He moved forward with a company of infantry mounted in half-tracks, approaching the compound from the west with weapons at the ready, expecting resistance or at minimum a rearguard action by SS troops who might be defending whatever administrative or industrial facility this represented. What they found instead would haunt every man who witnessed it for the remainder of his life. The compound sprawled across approximately 190 acres of wooded hillside, its perimeter defined by electrified barbed wire strung between concrete posts, backed by a secondary fence and overlooked by guard towers, positioned at intervals calculated to provide overlapping fields of fire. The main gate stood open. The guard towers were empty. No smoke rose from the weapons that should have defended the approaches. The entire installation appeared to have been abandoned in haste, as though its garrison had simply vanished rather than mounting even a token defense. But it had not been abandoned by everyone. As Parker's lead elements approached the gate, figures began to appear, stumbling out of barracks buildings, emerging from shadows, moving with a hesitant, disbelieving slowness toward the American vehicles. They wore striped uniforms that hung loose on frames reduced to bone and skin, their heads shaved or hair fallen out from malnutrition, their faces so gaunt that individual features had been erased by starvation until they resembled skulls with paper stretched across them. They moved like the dying, like people who had forgotten what it meant to walk upright, and when they reached the wire, they stood there silently, staring at the Americans with expressions that contained no hope, no joy, no recognizable human emotion, only a blank, patient suffering that had outlasted everything else. Parker had seen combat casualties. He had seen men torn apart by artillery, burned by tank fires, dying slowly from wounds that battlefield medicine could not treat. But what he was seeing now was different. This was not the immediate trauma of warfare, but the accumulated horror of systematic degradation, the reduction of human beings to something less than human through calculated deprivation and cruelty that had been sustained not for days or weeks, but for years. "Sir?" Lieutenant Hayes had dismounted from his tank and was standing beside Parker's half-track. "Sir, what is this place?" Parker had no answer. The intelligence briefings had mentioned German concentration camps, facilities where political prisoners and others deemed undesirable by the Nazi regime were interned. But the briefings had been sparse on details, focused on military objectives rather than humanitarian concerns. Nothing had prepared him for the scale of what he was witnessing: thousands of people, perhaps tens of thousands, imprisoned in conditions that reduced human existence to a struggle for survival measured in calories and the avoidance of arbitrary violence. "Move the infantry forward," Parker ordered. "Secure the compound. Get medical personnel up here immediately, and get me a line to division headquarters. They need to know what we've found." The infantry advanced through the open gate, weapons ready but finding no resistance. The German guards, SS Totenkopfverbände, the Death's Head units that had administered the camp system, had fled hours or days earlier, abandoning their posts as the Americans approached. They had left behind the evidence of their work, the barracks filled with the living dead, the punishment cells in the basements where prisoners had been confined in darkness for weeks at a time, the medical experimentation blocks where doctors had conducted research that violated every principle of medical ethics, and in the northern section of the compound, the crematorium complex where bodies had been disposed of with industrial efficiency. But they had also left behind something else, something that the initial reports did not mention and that would only become apparent over the following hours as American personnel moved deeper into the compound. In certain sections of Buchenwald, particularly in the areas designated for political prisoners, for Soviet POWs, for those classified as Nacht und Nebel, night and fog, people who were meant to disappear without trace, the survivors were different from those in the main camp. They were paler, if such a thing were possible, given the universal pallor of starvation. They moved differently, with a synchronization that was barely perceptible but undeniably present, as though they were responding to signals that no one else could hear. And their eyes, when they looked at their liberators, held something that was not quite human: a patience, a knowing, a quality that suggested they had been waiting not just for liberation, but for something else, something they expected the Americans to provide. Sergeant Michael Keller, a medic attached to the infantry company, was among the first Americans to enter the barracks designated as Block 46. The building was standard camp construction: wooden frame, concrete foundation, minimal insulation, designed to house perhaps 50 people in crowded conditions. It contained 237 prisoners, stacked in wooden bunks 3 levels high, many too weak to move. Keller had trained for battlefield triage, for the treatment of combat wounds and traumatic injuries. He had not trained for this: systematic starvation, untreated disease, injuries that had been inflicted deliberately and left to fester. He moved through the barracks, conducting rapid assessments, marking those who needed immediate evacuation and those who were too far gone for anything but morphine and the comfort that someone was present at the end. The work was mechanical, overwhelming, beyond anything medical training could prepare a person for. But halfway through the building, Keller encountered something that made him stop and call for Lieutenant Hayes. In a bunk at the far end of the barracks, separated slightly from the others, 6 prisoners lay in perfect alignment. They were not sleeping. Their eyes were open, fixed on the ceiling. They were not dead. Their chests rose and fell in synchronized rhythm. But they were not moving, not responding to external stimuli. And when Keller checked their pulses, he found heartbeats that matched precisely, 68 beats per minute. All 6 prisoners' hearts beating in unison as though controlled by a single mechanism. "Lieutenant," Keller said quietly, "you need to see this." Hayes approached, looked at the 6 prisoners, and felt something cold move through his chest. He had been in combat for 18 months, had developed the soldier's ability to compartmentalize horror, to function in conditions that reduced human life to tactical considerations. But there was something wrong about these prisoners, something that his mind struggled to categorize. They were not comatose. Their eyes tracked movement when Hayes passed his hand above their faces. They were not paralyzed. Their fingers occasionally twitched, moved in small, coordinated gestures that might have been random or might have been communication. But they were not present in the way that human beings should be present, not connected to the world in any way that Hayes could understand. "Get the medics," Hayes ordered. "Tag them for immediate evacuation. I don't know what's wrong with them, but it's beyond anything we can handle here." But over the following hours, as more of the camp was secured and more prisoners encountered, it became clear that the 6 in Block 46 were not unique. Throughout the compound, in multiple barracks, American personnel found groups of prisoners, sometimes in pairs, sometimes in larger numbers, who exhibited the same characteristics: synchronized movement, matching vital signs, eyes that were open but reflected no individual consciousness, and all of them, without exception, were found in areas where the camp records indicated that special medical experiments had been conducted, research projects supervised by SS doctors whose names would later become synonymous with atrocity. Lieutenant Colonel Parker established his command post in the camp's administrative building, a substantial structure that had housed the offices from which Buchenwald's operations were directed. The filing cabinets were full. The Germans had left in too much haste to destroy their records, and Parker assigned intelligence officers to begin reviewing the documents. What they found would take months to fully catalog and analyze, but certain patterns emerged immediately. Block 46 had been designated for medical experimentation. Prisoners had been infected with diseases to test vaccines. They had been subjected to extreme temperatures to study hypothermia and frostbite treatment. They had been exposed to toxic substances to determine lethal dosages. And in certain cases, according to reports signed by an SS Hauptsturmführer, whose name was Dr. Waldemar Hoven, prisoners had been subjected to what the documents described as psychological conditioning experiments designed to explore the limits of human consciousness and the possibility of creating altered mental states through a combination of chemical agents, sensory deprivation, and techniques that the reports did not specify but implied involved something beyond conventional medical practice. The pale prisoners, Parker would learn, were the survivors of these experiments. They were what remained when human consciousness was stripped away through systematic brutality, when the mind was broken so thoroughly that what returned was something other than what had departed. The Germans had been trying to create something, compliant workers perhaps, or soldiers who would follow orders without question, or simply to satisfy scientific curiosity about the malleability of human nature. They had succeeded in creating something, but not what they had intended. They had created hollow people, vessels that still breathed and moved, but contained no trace of the individuals who had once inhabited them. And as the American presence in Buchenwald extended through the evening of the 11th of April and into the night, as medical personnel struggled to provide care to thousands of people who were barely alive, as engineers began the grim work of documenting the crematorium and the mass graves in the surrounding woods, the pale prisoners began to do something that no one had anticipated. They began to wake up. Not as individuals, but as a collective. Their eyes, which had been blank and staring, began to focus. Their movements, which had been synchronized and mechanical, began to show purpose. And they began to speak, not in German or Polish or Russian or any of the dozen languages represented among Buchenwald's prisoner population, but in something else, something that sounded like language but contained no recognizable words, a susurrus of whispers that moved through the barracks where they were housed and seemed to carry meaning that existed beyond the capacity of human speech to convey. Something had been awakened in Buchenwald, something that had been waiting in the darkness, feeding on suffering, growing strong on the accumulated horror of 6 years of systematic atrocity. And now that the Americans had opened the gates, now that light had been brought into places that had known only darkness, it was ready to reveal itself. Lieutenant Colonel Parker had been awake for 19 hours when the first systematic report reached his command post. The initial chaos of liberation had given way to organized confusion. Medical personnel were establishing triage stations. Engineers were assessing infrastructure for potability of water and functionality of electrical systems, and civil affairs officers were attempting to compile lists of prisoners by nationality and status to facilitate eventual repatriation. The compound held approximately 21,000 prisoners, though exact numbers remained uncertain given the state of German record-keeping in the final weeks of the camp's operation. Most were in urgent need of medical attention. Many would not survive the night despite the best efforts of American doctors and medics. But the report that reached Parker at 21:45 hours was not about medical casualties or logistical challenges. It came from Captain David Brenner, the battalion surgeon, and it described a situation that Brenner admitted he did not understand and could not adequately explain using medical terminology. "Sir, we've isolated approximately 40 prisoners who present with identical symptomatology, all of them from blocks associated with the medical experimentation program, all of them showing signs of what I initially thought was catatonia or severe dissociation. But it's not that." Brenner's voice over the field telephone carried a tension that Parker had not heard before, not during the advance through France or the winter fighting in the Ardennes. "They're awake now. They're responsive. But they're responding as a unit, not as individuals." "Explain." "When I examine one of them, check pupil response, test reflexes, anything, the others react simultaneously. If I shine a light in one prisoner's eyes, all 40 prisoners blink at the same moment. If I stick one with a needle, all of them flinch. It's like they're connected somehow, like they share a nervous system. And they're speaking, sir. Not to us, to each other. But it's not any language I recognize, and they speak in perfect unison, like a choir following a conductor we can't see." Parker absorbed this information in the context of everything else he had witnessed that day: the starvation, the disease, the evidence of torture and murder conducted with bureaucratic efficiency. The human capacity for cruelty had been demonstrated beyond anything he had previously imagined. But what Brenner was describing suggested something beyond cruelty, beyond the scope of even the most perverse medical experimentation. "Isolate them," Parker ordered. "Keep them separate from the general prisoner population. I'm coming to your location. And Captain, Get an intelligence officer with German language capability. I want to know what's in the medical records for these prisoners specifically. Parker found the isolated group housed in what had been the camp's infirmary, a substantial brick building with barred windows and a basement that had served purposes better left unexamined. The 40 prisoners had been placed in a large ward on the second floor, arranged in beds that medical personnel had set up in neat rows. They lay motionless, their eyes open and fixed on the ceiling, their breathing synchronized to the point where the rise and fall of 40 chests occurred in perfect unison. The effect was deeply unsettling, a violation of the basic expectation that human beings should be individuals rather than components of something larger. Captain Brenner met Parker at the entrance to the ward, his medical bag in one hand and a clipboard in the other. He was a competent surgeon, experienced in battlefield trauma, but his face showed the strain of encountering something that medical training had not prepared him to address. "They've been like this for approximately 2 hours," Brenner reported. "Pulse rate steady at 72 beats per minute across all subjects. Respiration 14 breaths per minute. Body temperature averaging 96.8 degrees Fahrenheit, slightly hypothermic but consistent with general malnutrition. But watch this." He approached the nearest prisoner, a man who might have been 30 or 60. Starvation made age impossible to determine, and touched his shoulder gently. All 40 prisoners turned their heads simultaneously to look at Brenner. The movement was precise, mechanical, as though choreographed, and their eyes, when they focused on the doctor, held something that was not quite recognition and not quite hostility, but suggested both. "Jesus Christ," Parker whispered. "It gets worse." Brenner moved to the center of the ward where he could be seen by all the prisoners. "Watch their eyes. Watch closely." He raised his right hand. All 40 prisoners' eyes tracked the movement perfectly, following his hand as though connected by invisible strings. He moved his hand left, right, up, down. The eyes followed, never deviating, never blinking, all moving in exact synchronization. "They're not individual consciousnesses anymore," Brenner said quietly. "I don't know what they are, but they're not separate people. They're parts of something, components of a collective that shouldn't exist." Parker approached one of the prisoners, a woman young despite the ravages of imprisonment, her head shaved and her striped uniform marked with a triangle that identified her as a political prisoner. He spoke to her in the limited German he had learned during the campaign. "Wie heißen Sie? What is your name?" The woman's mouth moved, but the sound that emerged came not from her alone, but from all 40 prisoners simultaneously, a chorus speaking in perfect unison. "Wir sind die Vergessenen." We are the forgotten. "Who did this to you?" Parker asked. "Which doctors? What experiments?" Again the collective voice. "Die Ärzte wollten verstehen. Sie wollten die Grenzen des Bewusstseins erkunden. Sie haben uns gebrochen und wieder zusammengesetzt. Aber wir sind nicht das, was sie wollten. Wir sind etwas anderes." The doctors wanted to understand. They wanted to explore the boundaries of consciousness. They broke us and put us back together. But we are not what they wanted. We are something else. Major Thomas Klein, the battalion intelligence officer, had entered the ward during this exchange. He was a German Jewish refugee who had emigrated to the United States in 1938 and enlisted immediately after Pearl Harbor. He spoke the language with native fluency and understood the culture in ways that no amount of training could replicate. He listened to the collective voice, and his face went pale. "Sir, I've been reviewing the medical records from Block 46. The experiments conducted there, they weren't just testing drugs or studying disease progression. They were trying to break down individual identity. They used a combination of drugs, sensory deprivation, torture, and something they called collective conditioning. The goal was to see if human consciousness could be restructured, made compliant. transformed into something that would follow orders without question. And they succeeded, not in the way they intended. According to the notes, and these are fragmentary, the lead researcher fled before destroying all his files. The subjects didn't become compliant. They became something else. The individual minds collapsed, but instead of creating obedient automatons, the process created a shared consciousness. The prisoners stopped being individuals and became a collective entity that the researchers couldn't control. Parker looked at the 40 prisoners, their eyes now all focused on him, their expressions identical and unreadable. What happened to the researchers? Klein consulted his notes. Dr. Hoven, the camp physician, supervised the program until November 1944. He was arrested by the SS on corruption charges. Apparently, he was killing prisoners for personal reasons rather than research purposes, which even the SS found problematic. The experiments continued under a Dr. Ding Schuler, who committed suicide 3 days ago when he learned the Americans were approaching. But there was a third researcher, someone whose name appears in the files, but with minimal detail, listed only as Dr. Eisenberg. No first name, no SS rank, no indication of where he came from or where he went, just annotations in the margins of reports, observations about collective integration and boundary dissolution. "Find him," Parker ordered. "If he fled with the SS guards, he can't have gotten far. I want to know what was done to these people and whether it can be reversed." But even as he gave the order, Parker understood that finding Dr. Eisenberg would not solve the fundamental problem. The 40 prisoners were no longer entirely human in the conventional sense. They had been transformed into something that existed in a liminal space between individual and collective, between living and something else. And the real question, the question that would haunt the American personnel who encountered them, was whether they wanted to be returned to their individual identities or whether they preferred the collective consciousness into which they had been forced. At 22:47 hours, as medical personnel continued their evaluations and intelligence officers compiled information from the captured files, the collective made a request. It came from all 40 prisoners speaking simultaneously, their voices creating a strange harmonic effect that was both human and profoundly alien. "Wir müssen zu Block 46 zurück. Es gibt noch andere dort. Sie warten. We must return to Block 46. There are others there. They are waiting." Captain Brenner looked at Parker. "Sir, Block 46 was the experimentation block. We've cleared it. There were no additional prisoners there." "Wir müssen zu Block 46 zurück," the collective repeated more insistently. "Die anderen sind nicht wie wir. Sie sind nicht bereit. Sie müssen integriert werden. We must return to Block 46. The others are not like us. They are not ready. They must be integrated." "Integrated into what?" Parker demanded. The 40 prisoners sat up simultaneously in their beds, moving with such perfect coordination that it looked like a single entity with 40 bodies. Their eyes, all focused on Parker, held something that might have been desperation or might have been hunger. "In uns," they said, "into us. Wir wachsen. Wir müssen wachsen. Es gibt 12.000 in diesem Lager. Sie alle können beitreten. Sie alle können vergessen, was sie gelitten haben. Sie können Teil von etwas Größerem werden. We are growing. We must grow. There are 12,000 in this camp. They can all join. They can all forget what they suffered. They can become part of something greater." And Parker understood then what they were facing. The experiments had not just broken the prisoners and reconfigured their consciousness. They had created something that was infectious, a form of consciousness that could spread, that wanted to spread, that saw the thousands of traumatized, damaged prisoners in Buchenwald as potential components of an ever-expanding collective mind. "Lock this building down," Parker ordered. "No one enters or leaves without my direct authorization. Get me a platoon of infantry with orders to shoot anyone who tries to exit, and get division on the radio. We need specialists here. Doctors, psychiatrists, anyone who might understand what we're dealing with." But as the infantry formed a cordon around the infirmary, and as radio operators tried to raise higher headquarters on communications networks overtaxed by the rapid advance, the collective began to sing. It was not words exactly, more a sustained vocalization that resonated in frequencies that seemed to bypass the ear and speak directly to something deeper in the brain. The sound carried through the building, through the windows, across the camp where thousands of newly liberated prisoners were trying to sleep or simply trying to survive another night. And in the barracks throughout Buchenwald, prisoners who had never been part of the experiments, who had never been near Block 46, began to stir in their bunks. Their eyes opened, their breathing synchronized, and they began to hum in harmony with the collective song, joining something they did not understand but could not resist, becoming components of something that was growing stronger with each passing hour. Liberation had come to Buchenwald, but something else had been liberated as well, and it was hungry. The Night Watch reported the first conversion at 0312 hours. Private Daniel Kozlowski, stationed at a checkpoint between the infirmary and the main prisoner barracks, had been monitoring foot traffic when he noticed a man approaching from the direction of Block 22. The man moved slowly, as most of the survivors did, shuffling rather than walking, his striped uniform hanging loose on a frame that starvation had reduced to essentials. Nothing about him seemed unusual given the context. Kozlowski had let him pass with a nod, assuming he was heading to one of the latrine facilities. But the man had not gone to the latrines. He had walked directly to the infirmary where the 40 collective prisoners were being held, had stood outside the cordon established by the infantry platoon, and had simply waited. Waited with the perfect stillness that characterized the collective, his breathing falling into synchronization with something Kozlowski could hear through the infirmary's barred windows, that sustained harmonic vocalization that had been continuing for hours, rising and falling in patterns that seemed to carry meaning beyond mere sound. When Kozlowski approached to move the man along, he had looked into the prisoner's eyes and seen something that made him step back and call for his sergeant. The eyes were open, pupils dilated, but behind them was nothing. Or rather, behind them was something that was not the individual who had once inhabited that body. The man's lips were moving, synchronized with the collective song, and when he spoke, it was in that same unified voice that emerged from the 40 prisoners in the infirmary. "We're waxen," the man said. "We are growing. Es beginnt. It begins." By 0400 hours, 17 more prisoners had appeared at the infirmary perimeter, all exhibiting the same characteristics: synchronized movement, dilated pupils, voices speaking in perfect unison with the collective inside. They did not attempt to breach the cordon. They simply stood in a growing semicircle facing the building, their presence a statement of intent that required no verbal elaboration. The collective was spreading, reaching out through the camp, converting individual consciousnesses into components of something larger. Lieutenant Colonel Parker was roused from the brief sleep he had managed in his command post and brought to the perimeter at 0415 hours. He stood in the pre-dawn darkness, watching the growing assembly of synchronized prisoners, and felt the tactical situation shift from a humanitarian crisis to something that defied all conventional military response. His training had prepared him for enemy contact, for urban warfare, for the logistical challenges of maintaining an advance through hostile territory. It had not prepared him for an enemy that recruited its soldiers from those he was supposed to be liberating. "How fast is it spreading?" Parker asked Captain Brenner, who had remained at the infirmary throughout the night. "Exponentially. The original 40 seemed to be the core. They're broadcasting somehow. through that sound they're making, or through some mechanism we don't understand. Prisoners who are exposed become susceptible. Not all of them, not immediately, but a percentage. Maybe those who are most damaged psychologically, most desperate to escape their individual suffering. They hear the collective song and they join, stop being themselves and become part of it. Can we stop the transmission? Jam it somehow. It's not radio, sir. It's not any kind of electromagnetic signal we can detect. It's more fundamental than that. It's psychological, maybe even spiritual. The collective consciousness is reaching out and offering an escape, an end to individual pain through absorption into something greater. And for people who have suffered what these prisoners have suffered, that offer is apparently irresistible. Major Klein approached with a folder containing additional information extracted from the medical files. His face was grim, his eyes red from hours of reading documentation that detailed atrocities with clinical precision. Sir, I've found more about the experiments. Dr. Eisenberg, the researcher whose name appears in the margins, he wasn't SS. He wasn't even officially part of the camp staff. According to a memo from 1943, he was brought in from outside, from some research institute whose name is redacted from the files I've found so far. His area of expertise was what the Germans called Grenzwissenschaften, border sciences, parapsychology, consciousness studies, things that existed at the edge of legitimate scientific inquiry. You're saying he was studying the supernatural? I'm saying he was studying the boundaries of human consciousness. What happens when individual identity is broken down? Whether human minds can be linked together artificially. The Nazis were interested for obvious reasons. Imagine an army that thought and acted as a single organism, perfect coordination without need for communication, absolute obedience because there was no individual will to resist. But Eisenberg's notes suggest he discovered something they hadn't anticipated. When you break down enough individual minds and try to link them together, you don't create a controlled collective. You create something new, something that has its own desires, its own goals, its own consciousness that emerges from the interaction of all those broken pieces. Parker looked at the assembled prisoners, their number now approaching 30, all standing in perfect stillness, all breathing in synchronized rhythm, all waiting with inhuman patience for something that only they could anticipate. What does it want? To grow, to survive, to never be individual again, because individual existence means suffering and isolation and death. The collective offers something different, unity, purpose, the dissolution of the self into something larger that doesn't feel pain the way individuals do. Klein paused, consulting his notes. There's a phrase that appears repeatedly in Eisenberg's annotations. Das Überbewusstsein, the superconsciousness. He believed he was creating something evolutionarily superior, a form of human existence that transcended the limitations of individual identity. He created a contagion, Parker said flatly, and we just opened the door and let it loose on 21,000 traumatized people who are vulnerable to exactly the kind of psychological manipulation he designed it to exploit. The implication hung in the cold air between them. If the collective continued to grow at the rate Klein's analysis suggested, within days it could encompass the entire prisoner population of Buchenwald. 21,000 individuals reduced to components of a single, vast consciousness, speaking with one voice, moving with one purpose. And then what? Would it stop at the camp boundaries? Or would it spread beyond, reaching out to the American soldiers, to the German civilian population in nearby Weimar, to anyone vulnerable enough or damaged enough to hear its song and accept its offer of escape from individual suffering? At 0447 hours, as dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, the collective made its first direct appeal to the American forces. It came not from the infirmary, but from the assembly at the perimeter, 30 synchronized voices speaking in English, not perfect English, inflected with Polish and Russian and German accents, but comprehensible, coherent, directed at the soldiers who stood guard with weapons they understood were useless against this particular threat. "We mean no harm," the collective said. "We are not your enemy. We are the prisoners you liberated. We are what suffering has made us. We offer peace. We offer unity. We offer an end to the pain that defines human existence. Join us. Let go of your isolation. Become part of something greater." Several soldiers backed away from the perimeter, unnerved not just by the content of the message, but by the manner of its delivery. 30 mouths moving in perfect synchronization, 30 voices harmonizing into a single statement that resonated with the kind of absolute certainty that human communication rarely achieved. One private, a young replacement who had joined the battalion only weeks earlier, lowered his rifle and took a step forward, his eyes losing focus, his breathing beginning to match the rhythm of the collectives. Sergeant First Class Morrison, the platoon sergeant, grabbed the private and pulled him back physically, breaking the line of sight with the assembled prisoners. "Don't listen. Don't look at them directly. They're doing something to your head." But Morrison's warning came too late for Corporal James Sullivan, who had been standing closest to the perimeter. Sullivan had been a good soldier, steady under fire, reliable in combat. But he had also been carrying something that few of his fellow soldiers knew about. His younger brother had died at Anzio, and Sullivan had been fighting for 18 months with the knowledge that he had survived while his brother had not. That guilt, that isolation, that fundamental loneliness of individual existence made him vulnerable. The collective's song found the cracks in his psyche and wedged them open, offering an escape from the burden of selfhood. Sullivan's rifle clattered to the ground. His eyes went distant, and when he spoke, his voice joined the chorus of the collective, adding another instrument to the growing symphony of unified consciousness. "Ich bin nicht mehr allein," Sullivan said. In German he had never learned. "I am not alone anymore. Ich bin frei. I am free." He walked forward, past the perimeter, and the other synchronized prisoners opened their semicircle to admit him. When he took his place among them, his breathing fell into rhythm with theirs, his movements became synchronized, and whatever had been Corporal James Sullivan disappeared into something larger, something that now spoke with 31 voices instead of 30. "Pull back," Parker ordered. "All personnel, withdraw 50 yards from the perimeter. No one looks directly at the assembly. No one listens to what they're saying. We need to establish a quarantine zone until we figure out how to contain this." But as the Americans withdrew, and as the sky continued to lighten toward dawn, the collective began to move, not toward the soldiers, not in any aggressive manner, but in a slow, purposeful procession toward the center of the camp, toward the roll call square, where for 6 years, prisoners had been assembled for counting, for punishment, for selection. The synchronized prisoners moved in perfect formation, their footsteps creating a rhythm that echoed across the compound. And as they moved, they sang, not words now, but pure vocalization, harmonics that seemed to resonate with something fundamental in the human nervous system. And throughout Buchenwald, in every barracks where survivors were trying to rest or simply trying to comprehend that they might actually live through another day, prisoners began to wake. Not all of them, not even most of them, but enough. Those whose suffering had been most extreme, whose identity had been most thoroughly broken by years of systematic degradation, those who had nothing left of their former selves except pain and the desperate wish for it to end. They heard the collective's song, and they answered it. They rose from their bunks. They walked out of the barracks. They joined the procession moving toward the roll call square, adding their voices to the growing chorus, surrendering their individual consciousness to something that promised unity, purpose, and an end to the isolation that made suffering unbearable. By 0600 hours, As the sun broke above the horizon, the collective numbered 347. They stood in perfect formation in the roll call square, arranged in concentric circles around the 40 original prisoners who had served as the seed crystal for this growing consciousness. And in the center of those circles, standing on the platform where SS officers had once delivered speeches and announced selections, a single figure stood alone. A woman, elderly, her striped uniform marked with a yellow star that identified her as Jewish, her face scarred from beatings, but her eyes clear and focused. She spoke, and her voice was amplified, not by technology, but by the collective consciousness that spoke through her, using her as a conduit for communication with the Americans who watched from positions of cover throughout the camp. "We are the broken ones," she said in English, German, and Polish simultaneously, the languages overlapping and harmonizing in a way that made all three comprehensible to anyone listening. "We are what your war has created. We are what the Nazis tried to destroy but could not. We are what rises from suffering when suffering becomes too great to bear alone. We do not ask for your pity. We do not ask for your help. We ask only to be left in peace, to grow, to offer refuge to those who wish to escape the prison of individual existence. We are the future, whether you accept it or not. We are inevitable." Lieutenant Colonel Parker, watching from his command post, understood with absolute clarity that they were facing something unprecedented in human history, a consciousness that existed across multiple bodies, that grew stronger with each new addition, that offered something simultaneously horrifying and seductive to anyone damaged enough to be vulnerable to its appeal. And he understood that conventional military force could not stop it, because it was not an enemy that could be killed. It was an idea, a form of existence, a way of escaping from the fundamental loneliness of being human. The question was not whether it could be stopped. The question was whether it should be stopped. And that was not a question Lieutenant Colonel Parker was qualified to answer. The order to contain the collective came from 3rd Army headquarters at 11:47 hours, transmitted through division with the terse clarity that characterized General Patton's command style. The collective was to be isolated within a designated sector of the camp. Any prisoners attempting to join it were to be prevented from doing so by any means necessary, up to and including the use of lethal force. Medical personnel were authorized to sedate prisoners showing signs of susceptibility, and under no circumstances were American personnel to engage in direct communication with the collective or expose themselves to its psychological influence for more than brief, necessary periods. The orders were clear. Implementing them proved considerably more complex. Lieutenant Colonel Parker established a containment perimeter around the roll call square and the surrounding barracks where the collective had concentrated. 2 companies of infantry, approximately 400 men, were deployed in defensive positions with orders to prevent movement in either direction, neither allowing the collective to expand beyond its current boundaries, nor permitting additional prisoners to enter the containment zone. Medical personnel set up screening stations where survivors attempting to approach the collective could be intercepted, evaluated, and if necessary, sedated and moved to isolation facilities. But the collective was not a passive entity waiting to be contained. It understood what the Americans were attempting, and it responded with intelligence that suggested a level of strategic thinking that transcended any individual consciousness within it. At 1312 hours, the collective began to sing again, not the sustained harmonic that had characterized its earlier communications, but something different, a melody that carried emotional weight, that evoked memories of home and safety and peace, that touched something fundamental in the human psyche that transcended language or culture. Private Robert Chen, a Chinese-American soldier from San Francisco who had been manning a checkpoint at the perimeter, was the first American to fully convert. He had been listening to the collective's song for nearly an hour, had been watching the synchronized movements of the 347 prisoners who now comprised the unified consciousness, and something in that observation had spoken to a part of him that his military training had not armored. Chen was a good soldier, but he was also a young man far from home, surrounded by death and suffering, carrying the weight of combat experiences that he knew he would never be able to fully communicate to anyone who had not shared them. The collective's song offered an escape from that isolation, and Chen, exhausted, traumatized, lonely in ways he had not fully acknowledged, accepted the offer. He set down his rifle. He walked forward through the perimeter, and when he reached the edge of the collective's formation, the prisoners parted to admit him, their faces showing something that might have been welcome, or might have been hunger, or might have been both. Chen stood among them, and within seconds his breathing synchronized with theirs. His eyes lost focus and refocused on something that existed beyond individual perception. And when he spoke, it was with the collective's voice. "The soldier understands," the collective said through Chen and through 347 other mouths simultaneously. "He has seen what individual existence creates: war, suffering, the isolation that makes each person an island of pain. We offer something better. We offer unity." Sergeant Morrison, who had been Chen's squad leader, opened fire. Not at Chen. Morrison was a professional soldier who understood that Chen was already lost, but at the prisoners standing closest to the American, aiming for leg shots designed to incapacitate rather than kill, hoping that disrupting the collective's formation might somehow break its hold on Chen's consciousness. The bullet struck true. 3 prisoners went down with wounds that should have produced screaming, shock, the immediate trauma response of bodies damaged by high-velocity projectiles. But the wounded prisoners made no sound. They simply fell, their faces showing no pain, and the collective absorbed their suffering the way a vast ocean absorbs a single drop of water, acknowledging it, incorporating it, but remaining fundamentally unchanged by it. And the prisoners who had not been shot moved forward in perfect synchronization, filling the gaps left by the wounded, maintaining their formation with the precision of a drill team that had practiced for years rather than hours. "Cease fire!" Parker commanded. He had been monitoring the situation from a forward observation post and had seen immediately that conventional weapons were useless. You could kill individual components of the collective, but doing so did not damage the collective itself. It simply recruited more components to replace those that had been lost, growing stronger through each conversion, becoming more resilient with each addition to its unified consciousness. The wounded prisoners, who should have been dying or at minimum incapacitated, began to rise. Their leg wounds were severe, bones shattered, arteries torn, injuries that should have left them unable to walk. But the collective consciousness that animated them did not acknowledge pain in the conventional sense, did not recognize physical limitation as an obstacle to purpose. The wounded prisoners stood on shattered legs and rejoined the formation, leaving trails of blood behind them, but moving with the same synchronized precision as those who had not been injured. "Sir, this is wrong." Captain Brenner had joined Parker at the observation post, his medical bag clutched in white-knuckled hands. "Those people are dying. The ones who were shot, they're bleeding out. Their bodies will fail within minutes. But the collective is overriding their pain response, their survival instinct, everything that should make them stop and seek treatment. Can you treat them? If we could get them isolated from the collective, could you save them? Possibly. But we'd have to sedate them completely, shut down their consciousness to break the collective's hold. And even then," Brenner shook his head, "I don't know if there's anything left to save. The person who used to inhabit that body, the individual consciousness, it's gone, dissolved into something larger. We might be able to keep the body alive, but would we be saving a person or just preserving a component of something that isn't human anymore? The tactical situation continued to deteriorate throughout the afternoon. By 1500 hours, the collective had grown to over 500 individuals, with new converts joining at a rate of approximately 15 per hour. The American containment perimeter was holding, but barely. Soldiers who spent too long watching the collective, who listened too carefully to its song, began to show signs of susceptibility. Dilated pupils, synchronized breathing, a distant look in their eyes that suggested they were hearing something beyond the range of normal perception. Parker instituted new protocols: 30-minute rotation for perimeter guards, mandatory distance of at least 50 yards between American positions and the collective, orders to wear earplugs or headphones playing music to block the collective's harmonic transmissions. The measures helped, but did not eliminate the problem. The collective was broadcasting on multiple frequencies: auditory, visual, perhaps even electromagnetic or quantum, and conventional protective measures were only partially effective. At 1547 hours, the situation escalated. A group of approximately 200 prisoners from the main camp, those who had not yet been exposed to the collective but who had heard rumors of what it offered, began to march toward the containment zone. They moved not with the synchronized precision of the collective itself, but with the determined urgency of people who had made a decision and would not be deterred. They were walking toward liberation of a different kind, not freedom from the camp, but freedom from the burden of individual consciousness, from the memories of what they had suffered, from the loneliness of existence in bodies that had been broken and minds that had been traumatized beyond any conventional healing. "Block them," Parker ordered. "No one enters the containment zone. Use minimum necessary force." But minimum necessary force proved difficult to define when facing people who wanted nothing more than to surrender themselves to something that promised an end to suffering. The advancing prisoners were not armed. They were not violent. They simply walked forward with the inexorable purpose of water flowing downhill, seeking the lowest point, seeking the path of least resistance that would allow them to merge with something larger than themselves. The American soldiers formed a line, weapons raised but not fired, and attempted to turn back the advancing group through physical presence and shouted commands. But the prisoners kept coming, walking into the soldiers, pushing through gaps in the line, moving with a single-minded determination that made them willing to accept any consequence, injury, death, anything, if it meant reaching the collective that waited beyond the perimeter. Corporal Martinez, a veteran infantryman who had fought since Normandy, found himself face to face with a prisoner he had helped liberate only 24 hours earlier. A Polish man, maybe 40 years old, whose name Martinez had never learned, but whose eyes had held a gratitude that transcended language when the Americans had opened the camp gates. Now those eyes held something different, not gratitude, not fear, just a desperate hunger for dissolution, for the end of selfhood, for absorption into something that would take away the burden of individual memory. "Please," the man said in broken English, "let me go. Let me join them. I cannot bear this anymore. I cannot bear being myself." Martinez had orders. He had his duty, but he was also a human being looking into the eyes of another human being who was begging for release from suffering that Martinez could not fully comprehend. He hesitated, just for a second, just long enough. The Polish man pushed past him and ran toward the collective. Others followed, streaming through the gap in the line that Martinez's hesitation had created. Within 90 seconds, 47 prisoners had breached the containment perimeter and reached the collective's formation. They were absorbed immediately, their individual identities dissolving like salt in water, their bodies and minds becoming components of something larger that welcomed them with the wordless joy of incompleteness, achieving greater wholeness. "Fall back," Parker ordered. The containment had failed. The perimeter could not hold against people who wanted to join the collective, more than they wanted to survive as individuals. Establish a new line at the camp perimeter. No one leaves Buchenwald. American personnel only beyond this point. Anyone else tries to exit, they are turned back with whatever force is necessary. But as the Americans withdrew to establish their new defensive positions, as the collective grew to encompass over 600 individuals, something changed in its behavior. Up until now, it had been largely passive, broadcasting its song and accepting those who chose to join. Now, it began to move with purpose, flowing out of the roll call square and spreading through the barracks of the camp like an organism seeking nutrients, like a consciousness seeking new components to integrate into its growing whole. The collective divided itself into smaller groups, cells of 30 or 40 individuals that moved through the camp in coordinated patterns, seeking out the most vulnerable, the most damaged, those whose suffering had been so extreme that individual existence had become unbearable. And everywhere these groups went, the collective grew. Some prisoners fled, terrified of losing themselves. Others welcomed the approaching unified consciousness, opening their arms to embrace dissolution. By 1800 hours, as twilight settled over Buchenwald, the collective numbered 2,364 individuals. Nearly 12% of the camp's population had converted. Their individual consciousnesses dissolved into something that thought and spoke and moved as one. And the process was accelerating, growing exponentially as the collective's psychological reach extended, and as more prisoners chose unity over the terrible isolation of individual suffering. Lieutenant Colonel Parker, watching from his command post as the camp he had liberated transformed into something unprecedented in human history, made the hardest decision of his military career. He contacted division headquarters and requested authorization for what he knew would be recorded as either the most merciful or most monstrous act of the war. "Sir, we have lost control of the situation. The collective is growing beyond our capacity to contain through conventional means. I am requesting permission to implement Protocol Redwood." Protocol Redwood was a contingency plan for dealing with prisoner camps that might harbor epidemic disease, complete quarantine, closure of all entry and exit points, and if necessary, extreme measures to prevent the spread of contagion beyond the facility boundaries. The response from Division came after 17 minutes that felt like hours. Permission denied. Situation is being referred to higher command. Maintain current posture. Additional assets are being deployed to your location. Do not implement Protocol Redwood without explicit authorization from Theater Command. Parker acknowledged the order and returned his attention to the camp, where the collective continued its expansion, where 2,364 individuals had surrendered their separate existence to become something that humanity had never before created and might not be able to survive. And he wondered whether the reinforcements being sent would arrive in time, and what exactly they were expected to do against an enemy that recruited its soldiers from those it was supposed to protect. The specialists arrived at 0238 hours in 3 unmarked trucks, escorted by military police. They were not regular army personnel. That much was immediately apparent from their civilian clothing, their lack of visible rank insignia, and the way they moved with the confidence of people accustomed to operating outside standard military protocol. Their leader identified himself to Lieutenant Colonel Parker as Dr. Simon Rothstein, though he provided no credentials and no explanation of which organization or agency had authorized his presence. "We understand you have a situation involving what your medical officer described as collective consciousness infection," Rothstein said without preamble. He was perhaps 50, gray-haired, with a kind of calm demeanor that suggested he had encountered situations like this before, which should have been impossible, since nothing like this had occurred before in recorded history. "We've been tracking similar phenomena in other theaters. Smaller scale, usually contained before significant spread, but this He looked toward the camp where, even at this pre-dawn hour, the collective's song could be heard, a harmonic drone that carried across the distance like the sound of a vast engine idling. This is the largest manifestation we've encountered. What exactly are you tracking? Parker demanded. What the hell is happening in my area of operations? Rothstein gestured to his team, who began unloading equipment from the trucks, tanks that looked like flamethrower apparatus but were marked with symbols Parker didn't recognize, sealed containers that required 2 men to carry, and what appeared to be loudspeakers of unusual design. When the Nazis began their experimentation with consciousness manipulation, they opened doors that should have remained closed. They discovered that human identity is more malleable than anyone previously understood, and that under certain conditions, extreme trauma, sensory deprivation, chemical intervention, individual consciousness can be broken down and reconstructed. What Dr. Eisenberg discovered, what he created here, is what happens when you break down consciousness without properly reconstructing it. The fragments don't disappear. They merge. They form something new. You're saying the collective is a new form of life? I'm saying it's a new form of consciousness. Whether that makes it alive in the conventional sense is a philosophical question we don't have time to debate. What matters is that it's infectious, it's growing, and if it escapes this camp, it could spread beyond our capacity to contain. A consciousness that offers escape from suffering, that promises unity in place of isolation, in a world that's just endured 6 years of total war, that's experienced trauma on a scale humanity has never before witnessed. Do you have any idea how many people would choose to join it? The implications were staggering. Millions of displaced persons across Europe, survivors of camps and bombings and battles who carried psychological wounds that would never fully heal. Soldiers returning home with memories that would haunt them forever. All of them potentially vulnerable to a collective consciousness that offered relief from individual suffering through dissolution into something larger. How do we stop it? Parker asked. We don't stop it. We can't. The collective consciousness exists as an emergent property of the individuals who comprise it. As long as those individuals are alive and connected, it will continue to exist. Rothstein paused, and his next words carried the weight of a decision that had already been made at levels far above Parker's authority. We have to sever the connections, break the network, reduce the collective below the critical mass necessary for sustained, unified consciousness. You're talking about killing prisoners, people we just liberated. I'm talking about saving the rest of humanity from something that could end individual human existence as we know it. Yes, that requires killing some of the people who have already been absorbed by the collective. Not all of them, just enough to fragment it back into individuals, to drop it below the threshold where unified consciousness can sustain itself. Rothstein's expression was grim but determined. The alternative is allowing it to grow until it encompasses everyone in this camp, then everyone in Weimar, then spreading across Germany and beyond. We're not talking about saving lives, Colonel. We're talking about saving the concept of individual human consciousness. Parker had commanded men in combat for 2 years. He had ordered attacks that he knew would result in casualties, had made decisions that sent soldiers to their deaths in service of tactical objectives. But what Rothstein was proposing was different. This was not combat, but execution. Not warfare, but calculated killing of people who were victims rather than enemies. I need authorization from Theater Command, Parker said. I'm not implementing this without direct orders from General Eisenhower's headquarters. You already have authorization. Why do you think we're here? Rothstein handed Parker a document bearing signatures and stamps that confirmed what he was saying. This operation had been authorized at the highest levels, classified beyond anything Parker had encountered, approved by people who understood that some decisions were too terrible to be made by field commanders alone. At 04:15 hours, As dawn began to lighten the eastern sky for the second time since Buchenwald's liberation, the operation commenced. Rothstein's team deployed their equipment around the perimeter of the area where the collective had concentrated, now numbering over 4,000 individuals, nearly 20% of the camp's prisoner population. The loudspeakers were positioned at strategic locations and began broadcasting a sound that was almost but not quite music, a complex waveform that Rothstein explained was designed to disrupt the neural synchronization that allowed the collective consciousness to maintain coherence across multiple individuals. The effect was immediate and horrifying. The collective's song, that harmonic drone that had been constant for hours, began to break apart, individual voices emerging from the unified whole, screaming or crying or simply falling silent as the connections between them were forcibly severed. The synchronized movements that had characterized the collective became uncoordinated, bodies stumbling and falling as the shared consciousness that had been controlling them fragmented back into thousands of separate, confused, terrified, individual minds. But the disruption was not complete. The collective fought back, its unified consciousness recognizing the threat and adapting with a speed that suggested intelligence far beyond what any individual could achieve. Segments of the collective that were less affected by the sonic disruption began to move, flowing away from the loudspeakers, seeking areas where they could maintain their connection without interference. And as they moved, they grabbed at other prisoners who had not yet joined. Not gentle recruitment now, but desperate seizure, forcing unwilling individuals into physical contact that somehow accelerated the conversion process, expanding the collective, even as other parts of it were being torn apart. "Deploy the chemical agents," Rothstein ordered. His team moved forward with the tanks they had been carrying, approaching the edge of the collective's formation with weapons that resembled flamethrowers, but sprayed something that looked like mist rather than fire. The substance, Rothstein had not explained its composition, had simply called it the solvent, drifted across the collective's position, and where it touched the prisoners, something changed in their biology, some fundamental alteration that made it impossible for them to maintain the neural synchronization necessary for unified consciousness. The prisoners caught in the mist began to scream, not in unison now, but individually, each voice expressing its own unique agony as whatever had bound them together was chemically destroyed. They collapsed, convulsing, their bodies rejecting the forced unity that had been imposed upon them. Some died immediately, their systems unable to handle the transition from collective to individual existence. Others survived, but were left damaged in ways that medical science had no framework to understand or treat. Parker watched from his command post as the operation continued, as Rothstein's team systematically dismantled the largest manifestation of collective consciousness that humanity had ever created. He watched as 4,000 individuals were forcibly returned to separate existence, their unified consciousness shattered into fragments that would never fully reassemble. He watched as hundreds died, their bodies failing under the strain of forced individuation. And he watched as the survivors, those strong enough or fortunate enough to endure the process, collapsed in the mud, weeping, screaming, begging to be allowed to return to the unity they had lost. By 08:12 hours, the collective was broken. Fragments remained, small groups of 10 or 20 individuals who maintained partial synchronization, who moved with echoes of unified purpose, but the vast consciousness that had threatened to encompass the entire camp had been reduced below the critical threshold necessary for sustained existence. What remained were individuals again, separate and suffering, their brief escape from the prison of selfhood ended by force. Captain Brenner moved among the survivors with his medical team, triaging those who could be saved and administering morphine to those who could not. The casualties were staggering, over 800 dead, either from the direct effects of the chemical agent or from the physiological shock of forced separation from the collective. Another 2,000 were wounded or psychologically damaged beyond immediate treatment. Only a small percentage had survived the process intact, and even they carried psychological trauma that layered on top of everything else they had endured. "We saved them," Brenner said to Parker, his voice hollow. "We liberated them from the Nazis, then liberated them from the collective consciousness that offered escape from their suffering. We forced them back into individual existence, back into bodies that are broken and minds that are traumatized. We saved them, and I think they hate us for it." Parker had no response. He stood in the ruins of Buchenwald, surrounded by the evidence of two different kinds of horror: the systematic atrocity that the Nazis had perpetrated, and the desperate attempt at transcendence that the collective had represented, and understood that there were no good choices here, only terrible necessities and consequences that would haunt everyone involved. At 10:47 hours, as medical teams continued their grim work and as engineers began the process of documenting everything that had occurred, a soldier on perimeter patrol reported finding a body outside the camp fence. Not a prisoner, not an American, a German civilian, elderly, wearing a threadbare suit and carrying identification papers that listed his occupation as Wissenschaftlicher Berater, scientific advisor. Major Klein examined the papers and the body, noting the cyanide capsule still clenched between the dead man's teeth, the briefcase still handcuffed to his wrist. Inside the briefcase were journals, research notes, detailed documentation of experiments that had been conducted not just at Buchenwald, but at other camps, at civilian hospitals, at research institutes whose names had been redacted from official records. "It's him," Klein said quietly. "Dr. Eisenberg." He didn't flee with the other SS personnel. He stayed, watching, documenting, seeing what his creation would become. Klein opened one of the journals and read aloud from the final entry, dated 12th April, 1945. "The experiment has succeeded beyond all expectation. The Überbewusstsein is viable, self-sustaining, capable of growth and adaptation. It represents the next stage of human evolution, freedom from the isolation of individual consciousness, unity through dissolution of the self. The Americans will try to stop it. They will fail. Because what we have created here addresses something fundamental in human nature, the desperate desire to escape from suffering, to transcend the loneliness of separate existence. Other manifestations will occur, in other places, when the conditions are right, when enough people have suffered enough to be willing to surrender themselves to something larger. The future belongs to the collective, whether humanity chooses it or not." Parker took the journal and closed it, unable to read more. Dr. Eisenberg had killed himself rather than face capture, but his work would survive. The knowledge of how to create collective consciousness, the understanding of the psychological and chemical mechanisms that could dissolve individual identity, all of it was documented, preserved, ready to be studied, and potentially replicated by whoever found these notes. "Classify everything," Parker ordered. "The journals, the research notes, every document Eisenberg left behind. Maximum security classification. And I want every person who participated in this operation, my personnel, Rothstein's team, everyone, debriefed and sworn to secrecy. What happened here doesn't get recorded in official histories. It doesn't get discussed. It doesn't exist." But even as he gave the orders, Parker knew they were insufficient. Too many people had witnessed what had occurred. Too many soldiers and medics and support personnel had seen the collective, had heard its song, had been touched by the possibility it represented. Some of them would talk, despite the classification orders. Some would remember, despite attempts to file the memories away. And the knowledge would spread, slowly and incompletely, carried forward by those who had been present when humanity discovered that individual consciousness was not the inevitable condition of human existence, but merely one option among others. The battle for Buchenwald was over. But the war for individual human identity, the fundamental question of whether people should exist as separate minds or as components of something larger, had only begun. 8 days after the liberation and 5 days after the dissolution of the collective, Buchenwald had transformed from a scene of active crisis to one of slow, grinding aftermath. The immediate casualties had been buried, over 900 dead from the combined effects of forced separation from the collective consciousness and the chemical agents used to break their neural synchronization. The survivors, those who had been part of the collective and lived through its dismantling, were housed in a separate medical facility under constant observation, their condition unlike anything conventional medicine could classify or treat. Captain David Brenner had spent 5 consecutive days in that facility, documenting symptoms that had no precedent in medical literature and attempting treatments that were more guesswork than science. The survivors exhibited a constellation of problems that seemed to exist at the intersection of neurology, psychology, and something that had no name. They suffered from what Brenner initially diagnosed as dissociative disorders, profound disconnection from their own identities, difficulty distinguishing self from other, the sensation of missing something fundamental that had once been present. But it went deeper than dissociation. These people had experienced unity of consciousness, had been part of something larger than individual existence, and the forced return to separate selfhood had left them with a kind of phantom limb syndrome of the mind. "They keep trying to reconnect," Brenner reported to Lieutenant Colonel Parker during their evening briefing. "Not consciously, not deliberately, but their brains are attempting to re-establish the neural synchronization that defined the collective. I've observed groups of survivors unconsciously mirroring each other's breathing patterns, finishing each other's sentences, moving in coordinated ways without apparent communication. It's like they're still partially linked, or like they're mourning the loss of the connection they once had. Can they recover? Can they return to normal individual consciousness?" "I don't know what normal means anymore, sir." These people were traumatized before the collective formed. That's what made them vulnerable to it in the first place. Then they experienced something that human beings aren't supposed to experience, a form of consciousness that transcends individual identity. And then we forcibly ripped them out of that state and threw them back into separate existence. The question isn't whether they can recover. The question is whether there's anything left to recover to. Parker had visited the medical facility twice since the operation ended, had walked among the survivors, and seen the emptiness in their eyes. Not the blank synchronization that had characterized the collective, but a different kind of emptiness, the hollowness of people who had briefly touched something transcendent and were now condemned to ordinary human existence. Some of them spoke to him, asking in desperate whispers if there was any way to return, any way to rejoin what they had lost. Others simply sat in silence, staring at nothing, waiting for something that would never come again. The larger prisoner population, those who had not joined the collective, presented their own challenges. Approximately 16,000 survivors remained at Buchenwald, all requiring medical care, repatriation processing, and psychological support that the American military was ill-equipped to provide. Civil Affairs had established a system for identifying prisoners by nationality and arranging transportation to displaced persons camps or directly home when possible. But the process was slow, complicated by language barriers and the physical condition of people too weak to travel. And underlying everything was the question that no one wanted to articulate, but that everyone was thinking. What did liberation mean for people who had been so thoroughly broken that even liberation could not restore them? The Americans had opened the gates, had provided food and medical care, had stopped the killing. But they could not undo years of systematic degradation, could not erase memories that would haunt survivors for whatever remained of their lives, could not restore identities that had been destroyed as thoroughly as if they had been physically killed. Major Thomas Klein had spent the past 5 days interviewing survivors who had witnessed the collective's formation and dissolution, attempting to compile a coherent narrative of what had occurred. His reports, classified top secret and marked for immediate transmission to theater headquarters, painted a picture of something unprecedented, a form of consciousness that emerged spontaneously from extreme trauma, that offered genuine escape from suffering through dissolution of individual identity, and that might recur anywhere similar conditions existed. Sir, I've identified 17 survivors who claim to remember their time in the collective clearly, who can describe what it felt like from the inside, Klein reported. Their accounts are remarkably consistent. They describe it as peace, not happiness, not joy, but profound peace, the absence of fear, the absence of pain, the absence of the loneliness that defines individual existence. They describe feeling complete for the first time in their lives, connected to something larger than themselves, and they all say the same thing. Being forced back into separate existence was worse than anything the Nazis did to them. Are you suggesting we should have left them in the collective? Parker asked sharply. I'm suggesting that our intervention, necessary as it may have been from a strategic perspective, was experienced as a form of violence by the people it was supposed to save. We made the choice for them, that individual existence is preferable to collective consciousness, that separation is better than unity. But I'm not sure they agree with that choice, and I'm not sure we had the right to make it. The philosophical and ethical implications were beyond anything military training prepared officers to address. Parker had made the decision to authorize Dr. Rothstein's operation based on the assessment that the collective posed an existential threat to individual human consciousness. He had prioritized the preservation of humanity as it currently existed over the right of traumatized individuals to choose a different form of existence. That decision would be judged by others, would be analyzed and debated by people far removed from the immediate crisis, but Parker would carry the weight of it for the rest of his life. On the 17th of April, the first journalists arrived at Buchenwald. General Eisenhower had ordered that representatives of the press be brought to see the concentration camps to document the atrocities so thoroughly that no one could later deny they had occurred. The reporters and photographers who toured Buchenwald saw the barracks, the crematorium, the medical experimentation blocks. They interviewed survivors and photographed evidence that would shock the world and confirm the full extent of Nazi criminality. But they did not see the medical facility where the collective's survivors were housed. They were not told about the operation to dissolve the unified consciousness. Their reports would describe liberation in heroic terms, American forces arriving in time to save thousands of lives, bringing food and medicine and hope to people who had been condemned to death. The reports would be accurate as far as they went, but they would be incomplete, omitting the darker complexity of what liberation actually meant and what had been necessary to maintain it. Dr. Simon Rothstein departed Buchenwald on the 18th of April, his team's equipment loaded back into the unmarked trucks, all evidence of their presence carefully removed or classified. Before leaving, he met privately with Parker in the command post. "You did the right thing, Colonel. I know it doesn't feel that way now, but if the collective had been allowed to grow beyond Buchenwald's boundaries, if it had reached the general population, we would have faced a cascade effect that could have consumed entire cities. Individual human consciousness would have become an endangered condition. You prevented that." "At what cost?" Parker asked. "At the cost of some who had already been lost. The prisoners who joined the collective, they were casualties of the Nazi regime whether they physically died or not. Their individual identities had been destroyed by what was done to them. The collective was just the final step in a process of dehumanization that began years earlier. We didn't kill people, Colonel. We prevented the spread of something that would have killed the concept of personhood itself." Parker wanted to believe that. He needed to believe it. But as Rothstein drove away, and as Parker returned to the endless administrative work of liberation, he could not shake the image of those survivors in the medical facility, their eyes empty and longing, mourning something they could never articulate to anyone who had not experienced it. On 22nd April, the last of Buchenwald's survivors were evacuated to displaced persons camps or repatriation centers. The camp itself was turned over to Soviet authorities. Thuringia would fall within the Soviet zone of occupation, according to the agreements reached at Yalta. American personnel withdrew, their mission complete by the standards of military operations, if not by any broader measure of success. Lieutenant Colonel Parker submitted his final after-action report on the 24th of April. It described the liberation in conventional terms: enemy resistance minimal, prisoner population secured, medical assistance provided, repatriation process initiated. There was no mention of the collective consciousness, no reference to Dr. Eisenberg's experiments or Dr. Rothstein's operation, no acknowledgement that something unprecedented in human history had occurred within those barbed wire fences. But Parker wrote a second report, classified beyond anything in his previous experience, marked Eyes Only, and addressed directly to General Eisenhower's Chief of Staff. In that report, he documented everything: the formation of the collective, its growth and characteristics, the decision to intervene and the methods used, the casualties and consequences. He concluded with a warning that military planners needed to understand: the conditions that created the Buchenwald collective could occur again. Anywhere trauma was severe enough and suffering widespread enough, the potential existed for individual consciousness to collapse into something unified. And the military needed protocols, needed specialists like Rothstein's team, needed the capacity to respond before such manifestations grew beyond containment. The report was received, acknowledged, and disappeared into classified archives. Parker never learned whether anyone acted on his recommendations or whether his warning was simply filed away and forgotten. Captain David Brenner requested transfer to psychiatric services after Buchenwald, unable to continue practicing conventional medicine after witnessing what he had seen. He spent the remainder of the war treating combat neurosis cases, trying to help shattered individuals reassemble their sense of self, and wondering whether he was helping or simply preventing them from accessing the kind of escape the collective had offered. Major Thomas Klein emigrated to Palestine in 1946 and eventually became a professor of psychology, publishing papers on trauma and consciousness that never explicitly mentioned Buchenwald, but were clearly informed by what he had witnessed there. He spent his academic career trying to understand the boundaries of individual identity and what happened when those boundaries collapsed. Private Robert Chin was never seen again after his conversion to the collective. His body was not identified among the dead. Some accounts suggested he had wandered away during the chaos of the operation to dissolve the collective, had disappeared into the German countryside, perhaps still carrying fragments of the unified consciousness that he had briefly joined. The army listed him as missing in action, presumed dead, and his family received the standard notification. They never learned what had actually happened to their son. And in the medical facilities where the collective's survivors were treated, in the displaced persons camps where they were eventually housed, in the homes they eventually returned to if they survived that long, the hollow people continued to exist, neither fully individual nor any longer part of something greater, carrying within them the memory of a form of consciousness that humanity was not ready to acknowledge and could not afford to permit. They were living testaments to a truth that would remain classified for decades. That individual identity, the foundation of human society and law and morality, was more fragile and more negotiable than anyone wanted to admit. Seven years after the war ended, Dr. Margaret Feinstein, a psychologist specializing in trauma and consciousness studies, was granted access to a cache of classified documents related to psychological operations in the European theater. She had been vetted through 5 levels of security clearance, had signed non-disclosure agreements that carried criminal penalties for violation, and had been explicitly warned that the materials she was about to review contained information that could not be discussed outside approved channels. She expected documents on interrogation techniques, psychological warfare operations, perhaps studies on enemy morale. What she found instead would define the remaining 40 years of her professional life. The Buchenwald files occupied 3 archive boxes, their contents meticulously organized and cross-referenced. Dr. Feinstein spent 2 weeks in a windowless reading room, reviewing documents that described something that should not have been possible: the spontaneous formation of collective consciousness among trauma victims, its rapid growth through what the reports called psychological contagion, and its forcible dissolution through methods that the files detailed with clinical precision but obvious discomfort. The documentation was thorough. Lieutenant Colonel Parker's classified after-action report provided the military perspective. Captain Brenner's medical notes described the physiological and neurological symptoms. Major Klein's interviews with survivors offered insight into the subjective experience of collective consciousness. And Dr. Rothstein's technical reports, filed not through military channels, but through what appeared to be a civilian intelligence organization that predated the CIA, explained the theoretical framework and the intervention protocols. But what disturbed Dr. Feinstein most was not the event itself, but the pattern it revealed. Buchenwald was not unique. The files contained references to similar incidents at other concentration camps: Dachau, Mauthausen, Bergen-Belsen, where survivors exhibited synchronized behavior and shared consciousness following liberation. The manifestations had been smaller, the collectives had formed more slowly, but the pattern was consistent. Extreme trauma, combined with the sudden removal of external structure and the introduction of freedom that traumatized individuals were psychologically unprepared to handle, created conditions where individual consciousness could collapse into something unified. And the pattern extended beyond the concentration camps. Reports from psychiatric hospitals treating combat veterans described isolated cases of what doctors called consciousness sharing: pairs or small groups of patients who exhibited synchronized symptoms, who seemed to experience each other's memories, who spoke of being connected in ways that transcended normal empathy. Reports from prisoner of war camps, from civilian areas that had experienced prolonged bombing, from any location where mass trauma had occurred and populations remained in close proximity, all contained hints of the same phenomenon. Dr. Rothstein's theoretical framework, which occupied an entire box of its own, proposed that collective consciousness was not an aberration, but a latent capability of human neurology that was normally suppressed by social conditioning and individual identity formation. Under extreme stress, when the psychological structures that maintained separate selfhood were destroyed, the brain's natural tendency towards synchronization and mimicry could create bridges between individual minds. The process was facilitated by proximity, by shared experience, by the kind of trauma that made individual existence unbearable. And once a collective reached critical mass, what Rothstein estimated at approximately 40 synchronized individuals, it became self-sustaining, capable of recruiting new members, and growing exponentially. But Rothstein's research did not end with Buchenwald. In documents dated 1946 through 1951, he described a systematic program to study and potentially replicate collective consciousness under controlled conditions. The program, cryptonym Project Unity, had been authorized at the highest levels and was being conducted at undisclosed facilities with volunteer subjects who were told they were participating in studies on group dynamics and team coordination. The goal, according to a memo dated March 1948, was to determine whether collective consciousness could be induced deliberately, whether it could be controlled and directed, and whether it could be weaponized as a tool of psychological warfare. Dr. Feinstein closed the final file and sat in the reading room, understanding that she had just reviewed something that fundamentally challenged assumptions about human consciousness and individual identity. The documents confirmed that the boundaries between separate minds were more permeable than psychological theory acknowledged. They demonstrated that unity of consciousness, the dissolution of individual selfhood into something larger, was possible under specific conditions. And they revealed that elements of the United States government were actively studying how to create and control such phenomena. She was also acutely aware that the classification level attached to these files meant they would never be publicly disclosed. The knowledge would remain sequestered, accessible only to those with appropriate clearances and legitimate need to know. The survivors of Buchenwald's collective would live out their lives carrying memories they could never share, experiences they could never validate through public acknowledgement. And the broader implications about the nature of consciousness, about the fragility of individual identity, about what humanity had learned regarding the malleability of the self, would remain hidden from the academic and scientific communities that should have been studying them. Dr. Feinstein submitted her analysis report 3 weeks later. She confirmed that the documents appeared authentic, that they described genuine phenomena rather than disinformation or psychological operations, and that they represented a body of knowledge that had profound implications for understanding trauma, consciousness, and human identity. She recommended continued study, suggested protocols for monitoring populations at risk of spontaneous collective formation, and noted that the ethical issues raised by Project Unity required oversight beyond what military or intelligence structures could provide. Her recommendations disappeared into the same classification system that had produced the documents she had reviewed. Project Unity continued, its results never publicly disclosed. In the broader pattern, the truth that extreme trauma could dissolve individual consciousness and create something unified, that human identity was a construct rather than an immutable condition, that the choice between separateness and unity was more complex than Western philosophy acknowledged, remained classified, suppressed, forgotten by all except those who had witnessed it directly, or those few, like Dr. Feinstein, who were granted access to the archived truth. The survivors, those pale prisoners who had briefly been part of something larger than themselves, scattered across the world in the decades following liberation. Some attempted to rebuild individual lives, to reintegrate into societies that had no framework for understanding what they had experienced. Others never recovered, spending their remaining years in institutions, diagnosed with conditions that approximated but never quite matched their actual symptoms. And a very few, found each other, drawn together by some residual connection that conventional psychology could not explain and that they themselves only partially understood. In 1963, 18 years after Buchenwald's liberation, a small community formed in a village outside Tel Aviv, Israel. It consisted of 23 individuals, all survivors of Nazi concentration camps, all former members of collectives that had formed briefly during liberation before being forcibly dissolved. They lived communally, shared resources, and exhibited patterns of coordination that outside observers attributed to cultural practices or religious tradition. But those who visited the community and spent time with its members reported something unsettling. The residents seemed to share thoughts, finish each other's sentences with uncanny accuracy, move in patterns that suggested unconscious coordination. And when asked about their experiences during the war, they spoke in ways that blurred the boundaries between I and we, as though individual identity remained partially dissolved even 2 decades after their collective had been broken. The Israeli government monitored the community quietly, aware through intelligence channels of what had occurred at Buchenwald and concerned about the possibility of collective consciousness reforming. But the community remained small, never growing beyond its original 23 members, never exhibiting the kind of aggressive recruitment that had characterized the Buchenwald collective. It simply existed, a remnant of something that had been forcibly ended, a living reminder that some experiences permanently altered the boundaries between self and other. Lieutenant Colonel Samuel Parker, retired from the Army in 1946, never spoke publicly about Buchenwald. He worked in various civilian capacities, served on veterans organizations, lived what appeared to be a normal post-war life. But his daughter would later report that he suffered from nightmares throughout his life, that he would wake speaking about decisions he had made and wondering whether they were correct, that he carried a burden of knowledge that he could never share and could never fully reconcile. He died in 1977, and among his personal papers, his family found a journal entry dated 11th April 1970, the 25th anniversary of Buchenwald's liberation. In it, he had written, "We opened the gates and freed the prisoners from one form of bondage. But what we found inside was something else. People so thoroughly broken that they had discovered a way to exist beyond individual suffering through collective unity. We forced them back into separate existence because I believed, that individual consciousness was worth preserving even at the cost of continued suffering. I still believe that was the right decision, but I am no longer certain it was the merciful one." The official history of Buchenwald's liberation, published by the U.S. Army in 1981, makes no mention of the collective consciousness. It describes the camp's conditions, the liberation by the 6th Armored Division, the medical care provided to survivors, and the eventual repatriation of prisoners. It is accurate in every detail that was deemed appropriate for public disclosure. It is also fundamentally incomplete, omitting the most significant aspect of what occurred there: the discovery that human consciousness could transcend individual boundaries, that identity was more fluid than anyone acknowledged, and that extreme suffering could produce not just psychological damage, but a transformation into something that was neither human, as traditionally understood, nor entirely other. The documents remain classified. Project Unity's results, if it produced any, remain sequestered in archives accessible only to those with clearances so rare that most intelligence professionals are unaware the program ever existed. The survivors who remember what collective consciousness felt like from the inside carry their knowledge to graves that are now mostly filled, taking with them the subjective experience of what it means to stop being a separate self and become part of something larger. But the phenomenon has not disappeared. In psychiatric literature, buried in case studies and clinical reports, there are occasional references to what researchers call shared traumatic consciousness. Small groups of trauma survivors who exhibit synchronized symptoms, shared memories, coordinated behavior that suggests connection beyond normal empathy. The papers are published in obscure journals, their significance overlooked by mainstream psychology, their implications never fully explored because the theoretical framework necessary to understand them remains classified. And in conflict zones, in areas where populations have experienced mass trauma, in refugee camps and displaced person centers, aid workers occasionally report something strange. Groups of survivors who move with unusual coordination, who speak in ways that blur individual boundaries, who seem to share consciousness in ways that Western psychology cannot explain. The reports are filed, noted, and quietly referred to specialists who understand what they indicate. The groups are monitored, sometimes dispersed, occasionally subjected to interventions that break their synchronization before collective consciousness can fully form. The knowledge exists, scattered and suppressed, that human consciousness is more malleable than we acknowledge, that individual identity is a choice rather than an inevitability, that under the right or wrong conditions, the boundaries between separate minds can dissolve. That knowledge is kept hidden because acknowledging it publicly would force uncomfortable questions about the nature of personhood, the basis of law and morality, the meaning of individual rights and freedoms. If consciousness can be collective, if identity can be shared, if the self is negotiable rather than fixed, then many assumptions about human society require fundamental reevaluation. So the truth remains classified, the documents remain sealed, the survivors remain silent or unheard, and humanity continues to operate under the comforting fiction that individual consciousness is the only consciousness, that separation is the only condition, that the boundaries between self and other are fixed and immutable. But those who know the truth, who have read the files or witnessed the phenomenon or experienced it directly, carry a different understanding. They know that human consciousness stands at a threshold, that trauma and technology and social change are creating conditions where collective consciousness might emerge again, spontaneously or deliberately. They know that the choice between individual and collective existence, between the isolation of separate selfhood and the unity of shared consciousness may be the defining question of humanity's future. And they watch, always watching, waiting for signs that the pale prisoner's legacy might manifest again, that somewhere in the darkness of human suffering, individual minds might begin to synchronize, to connect, to dissolve into something larger, waiting with protocols and interventions ready, prepared to prevent what happened at Buchenwald from happening again. Or perhaps prepared to decide whether next time the intervention should be different, whether next time humanity might be ready to choose unity over separation, to embrace collective consciousness rather than forcibly dissolving it. The files do not address that question. They cannot. Because answering it would require confronting truths that civilization has built itself to avoid, acknowledging that the foundation of individual identity may be more fragile and more temporary than anyone wants to admit. End of declassified section. Further documentation restricted under Executive Order 13,526 and associated special access programs. Addendum dated 14th March 2003. Following the reclassification review mandated by the Nazi War Crimes Disclosure Act, certain materials related to liberation operations have been approved for limited release. The Buchenwald liberation is documented in approved historical accounts. Medical records of liberated prisoners remain classified due to privacy considerations and international agreements regarding human subjects research. Researchers seeking information on psychological phenomena observed during camp liberations should direct inquiries to the appropriate archival authorities. Be advised that certain categories of information remain classified under statutory provisions that supersede general declassification timelines. The question of whether human consciousness is inherently individual or whether it can become collective under specific conditions remains an active area of theoretical research in classified programs. Personnel with appropriate clearances and legitimate need to know may request access through established channels.